Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the Science Policy Group's event with our local state senator, Scott Bennett. Thank you all for coming. My name is David Stevens. I am a second year, going on third year, chemistry PhD, working in computational chemistry with Dr. Sharon Hamish-Schiffer in Chemical Life Sciences building, and I am a member of Science Policy Group. First of all, I would like to thank all of the Science Policy Group members who are part of the organizing team who've really worked together to put this event together. I would like to also thank the Beckman Institute and everyone at the Beckman Institute has been so welcoming and helpful with helping put this event together as well. In addition to Senator Scott Bennett's team, and Senator Bennett, and especially Ms. Michelle Gonzalez, and also everyone else who has made this event possible. I would like to remind everyone that if you'd like to stay current with our future events for Science Policy Group, we have our website, check out our website, and also sign up in the lobby with our listserv. We have some really interesting, fun things coming up. For instance, we have a reading group about intersectionality in STEM. As well, we will be putting together a workshop on how to write a strong application for science policy fellowships. We also have a handout about state legislation and how a bill is passed in the state of Illinois out in the lobby. So if you've not picked that up, please go ahead and pick that up. We've worked on putting that together. I'm very proud of that as well. And at the end of Senator Bennett's lecture, we'll be taking questions. And so we have 2 microphones here at the bottom. And so if you have questions, please form a line and we'll go one by one on the microphones. Now it is my pleasure and my honor to introduce State Senator Bennett. Illinois has been his home, his family home, for over 5 generations. He has received his bachelor's in history at the Illinois State University and in history, and his JD here at UIUC in 2002. He worked as an attorney until 2015 when he was appointed, emphasis on appointed, to the Illinois Senate to represent the 52nd District. Last year he was elected for a 4-year term in the Illinois Senate. He pushed tirelessly for the state budget, which we now thankfully have, advocated for university funding, and he has worked hard to maintain clean drinking water from the Muhammad Aquifer. We are grateful that he accepted our offer here to speak at this event. In addition, he got to tour the Beckman Institute before this event happened. And so there he got to see the Autonomous Materials Center, as well as the Biomedical Imaging Center, which was really awesome. I haven't been around Beckman, so I got to see that as well, so that was cool. So if you have not seen that here at Beckman, there are many amazing things here at Beckman, which he got to see. After this event, he'll be having dinner with several STEM graduate students who are active in various STEM leadership organizations. So without further ado, I would like to welcome State Senator Scott Bennett.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Let me tell you, no one claps when we say you push for the state budget. So that makes me feel really good, and that is certainly rare right now. That was a very kind introduction, and I certainly appreciate the invitation. The question was asked right before I got up here, have you ever spoke to a room full of PhDs before? No, that doesn't happen. For the last 2 weeks, or at least a few weeks, people have been sending me texts and email pictures of the advertisement for this event around campus. And they said, I hear you're going to speak at Beckman on science for an hour. What do you know about science? And the answer is not a thing. I didn't feel a lot better after my tour of Beckman, where I have all these graduate students, people 15, 20 years younger than me. They were explaining polymers and MRIs and all these amazing innovations that are happening. And I'm thinking, I have nothing to teach these people, just to be clear. But I'm happy to come and talk a little bit about the political process, about some of the legislation that's going on right now that may affect science, and ways in which you can help advocate for your causes going forward. There is a sense, and I think it's very true, that oftentimes the people writing the laws and writing the very things that affect your jobs don't have a clue what they're doing. This was always true to me as a lawyer when, again, most recently I was a prosecutor here in Champaign County, and laws that would literally affect the rest of someone's life, whether they got a life sentence or 10 years or all those things. You're thinking, who wrote this law? Are they even lawyers? Do they have any clue what happens in a courthouse? And then I go to the legislature and find out that's actually the case. Most of them are lawyers, most of us, most people on those committees simply have an interest in those areas. And the problem is when you're listening to people you don't know, you often are susceptible to the person who pretends like they know. And often they don't have a PhD or any expertise in those fields. They might be a paid advocate for one cause or another. So I think it really is important that those of you that are involved in these areas learn how the best ways to make your voice heard and make sure that legislation is going in the direction that you expect it to go. As you heard in my biography, I have a kind of a strange path to politics. I don't have a long history there. I was appointed actually the same week that Governor Rauner was appointed, or that he came in, was inaugurated. So it's been kind of a weird time in politics, of course, in the last 2.5 years. I was a prosecutor before that, and when I came in, I wouldn't say that I didn't know anything about politics. I was active in the community and knew a lot of the local legislators through just community events. And it struck me as, if you go into a situation like that and try to be an expert in everything, you are destined to fail. So instead, it was more important to me to say, where can I try to find some areas where maybe I do have a little expertise, or at least more knowledge than the average person, and how can I try to advocate for those causes? So while I have some laws that I've been lucky enough to actually get some things passed with a Democratic legislature and a Republican governor, they have been largely in 3 different areas. One, agriculture. As was mentioned, my family has farmed about 30 miles north of here, the same plot of land since it was prairie, since the 1840s and 50s. And so that's, while my dad didn't make his living that way, he was the oldest of 5, went to dental school and became a small-time dentist. He still at night would go out and farm, and we spent a lot of time there. And the plight of the farmer is very important to me. And so a lot of my legislation involves agriculture. Second area, because I was a prosecutor largely dealing with cases involving young children as victims, have been in that field in ways to make sure that that court process is an easier, it's not easy, never is easy for a child to testify in some of these cases, but it's a little bit easier in that they have a chance to hear their cases heard. And the third has to be higher education. I have the distinction of the district that I represent contains the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. I also have 2 very fine community colleges in Parkland College and Danville Area Community College, which in many ways continue to churn out the workforce of those communities. And it's really important to me at a time when I don't know who it really is, who else it's important to, that we fight for higher education. That's for me important for a couple different reasons. One, of course, is today's economy. If you look at Champaign, Urbana, the largest employer, of course, is the University of Illinois. It lost actually 600 employees this year because of largely a lot of these budget issues. And yet, if you look at the employers 2 through 7 and you add them up together, you still don't have enough employees that equals the University of Illinois. So obviously, it's important for today's economy in Champaign and why it's important to continue to fight for higher education, both community college and university level. But more importantly, and for people in this room, it's what the graduates of the University of Illinois will mean to the state and this country, this world in the future. Just spent a little bit of time going through just certain areas. MRI is one of the examples. One of the 24 Nobel Prizes that come to this university has been to the MRI. The ways that has changed this world for the better, cannot be overstated. As an example, my daughter wasn't an MRI, it was actually an ultrasound. Before my daughter was even born, they could tell through ultrasounds that her organs were in the wrong spot. She was like 4 months away from actually being born. They were able to say, we've got a real problem here. Her heart is not in the right side of the body. And so often that leads to some severe complications. It allowed us to make all these decisions and make all these plans throughout the rest of the pregnancy that made sure that she was able to be born healthy and do all the tests you need to do to secure as normal as possible of a life of a child. That's unbelievable to me, that they are able to do that before a child's even born, to know we better have some experts there at the time of birth. The innovations that are coming here are saving lives every day, and I think that cannot be overstated. I'm supposed to talk about science. That's kind of a broad topic. And so I think what I'd like to do is really kind of put it in 2 different categories. Certainly in legislation, science, unless we take a really weird turn in Illinois and start to say whether we should be teaching science in the Bible and things like that, I don't think you have to worry about the existence of science. That's going to continue. That was just a good joke. Well, always good to go and laugh. But I think the number one spot you see science in legislation is the environment, right? And how the laws that we pass that regulate everything in our lives involving the environment often are either driven by or driven by people who deny the science of those areas, right? So one of the biggest priorities for me when I first got to Springfield was the water supply of this area. We get our water here, for those of you that don't know, from an underground river called Muhammad River. And it's not just Champaign or Man, it's about 800,000 people across central Illinois. It's a huge swath of the state. And about 12, 13 years ago now, that water supply became somewhat threatened because one county, not Champaign County, but a rural county north of here, made an agreement to put a landfill company in their county. So it was their prerogative, it's over their county, but it's also under one of the fingers of the underground river. And so it's a great example of how a decision entirely made in another county by that county government could affect the drinking water you get out of your drinking fountain here today. And in part, as you can imagine, landfill companies use very rural, very desolate spots for the landfill areas because if you put it on University Avenue across from Beckman, people will notice and probably complain. So you go to counties that are desperate for money and say, how about we sign a contract for $1 million a year? And the counties usually say, where do we sign? And they say, you probably want to know what we want to store in your land. You're like, that's really not important. Where do we sign? And that's kind of what happened in the early 2000s in DeWitt County. And a small group of DeWitt County citizens, not people you would consider environmentalists by any stretch, just started saying, hey, we're kind of concerned with some of the chemicals you're putting there, PCBs and other chemicals that were being stored directly over the aquifer. And they've been assured, of course, by the landfill companies, oh no, we've got liners, we've got all these things that make sure that this is safe. But a very valid question is, but what if you're wrong? What happens when these chemicals get in this underground river? How do we remove it? And where do you find more clean water for 800,000 people? And later, this aquifer was designated by the Illinois EPA, or excuse me, by the federal EPA, as a sole source aquifer, meaning this whole area, 800,000 people, that's the only source of their water, is what comes from this underground river. So it's pretty important, and safeguarding becomes very important. So in terms of legislation, what happened at that point? Well, what starts small, probably a group of scientists, a group of concerned citizens, became more and more vocal. They go to the county board. The county board in DeWitt County fought back and forth for a while. It sometimes became violent. There was actually fights in parking lots and things over this because one group saying, hey, the reason our property taxes are so low is because this landfill company has got this $1 million contract. Don't screw that up for me. I don't want to see my property taxes raised. And then you have another group of people saying, what difference does it make if if there's carcinogens in our water and we've got a problem for our children? That's another concern. So you have two fairly valid arguments going back and forth, and often it became violent. But what happened was that the argument left DeWitt County and came to Champaign, it went to Springfield, it went to Decatur, because all these places got their water from the same underground river. And you start seeing Republicans as well as Democrats working together on this issue and say, I'm not sure there is a partisan side to clean drinking water. This is probably something we should be for. But it became an issue. The landfill company wasn't breaking any laws. They were just simply putting these chemicals over on the ground, high above the aquifer. So legislators had tried several times to pass some kind of laws, but they were often overbroad, and often they were killed in the legislature, never really got it. And this is where, when I came into office, I took it up with new state representative Carol Ammons, those of you who know Carol, and we decided this has got to be our number one priority. We have to get this done. And there was a hearing, my first bill that I got out of you can see from this, actually, it's probably on here, that any bill, before it becomes a law, it doesn't just go to the Senate floor and get voted on. There's a committee, right? And the goal is that committee is formed of experts, and that's a loose term. They might have PhDs, but I, as a senator, have about 5 committees that I serve on. This committees range from 8 to about 14 people. And the goal is every single bill that has to do with agriculture, for example, I'm the vice chair of agriculture, every single bill that has to do with agriculture comes before that committee. So I better know more about agriculture than a lot of other people, and I do after serving them a few years. And the goal is that the bill will take a while to get through that. Maybe we'll say, you gotta come back and fix this, you gotta amend it, you gotta do these things before it ever gets past the committee and gets the majority number of votes. And only then can it go before the full Senate for a vote, okay? And then it has to go to the House and repeat the same process before it ever sees the governor. So there's so many places to kill a bill if you're creative or if you have deep pockets to have lobbyists that can do this. And this is a great example where I was so naive when I first got there, and I said, this is great. I mean, Republicans have been for this. I found a Republican co-sponsor. Everybody's going to be for clean drinking water. And then I start to hear, we get all these phone calls. I think the committee was on Tuesday. I think it was Friday afternoon. I started hearing like, you've got like 200 opponents to this bill. I think, well, who are these 200 people that don't want us to have clean drinking water? That wasn't the case. But what you have to think about is every dollar in the budget, every bill that's out there has a constituency. There's somebody who's fighting for it. And when you think about it, nobody is, I'm sure the landfill company isn't thinking, we can't wait to poison Scott Bennett's children. They're thinking, we're not doing anything wrong, we're being completely responsible, but we have, this is bad waste that has to go somewhere. We're being responsible and we're being, martyred, we're being attacked for this. And every landfill company belongs to an association of a bigger landfill company, which belongs to a bigger association of all the manufacturers in the state. And they belong to the Chamber of Commerce, which is a pretty powerful thing. And pretty soon you say, oh, okay, now we've got all these interest groups that are coming forward and saying, this bill is way too broad. Sure, everybody's for a clean Muhammad Aquifer, but if this bill passes, you couldn't store any of these chemicals anywhere in the state because you could argue that some tributary is near this and that goes into a river and goes into a bigger river and then eventually 40 miles away goes into the Muhammad Aquifer. And so we began a process of saying, okay, well, what is passable? What can we do? And Representative Ammons and myself sat down with the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency as well as our Republican co-sponsor Chapin Rose and began to really kind of work to say what are the biggest threats right now to the Muhammad Aquifer. And there were several, right? There's several really nasty things they were storing over it. But the federal government, I think, really helped us out as well as, I would point out it's the last administration, as well as the Illinois Attorney General and helped to negotiate an agreement that said, how about no more PCBs, which is kind of the worst of those things. You won't store any more PCBs on that site. And so the company said, fine, don't sue us, and we'll take that part out. And so then we looked at what's the next nastiest thing that we could find. It's a thing called manufactured gas plant waste. And whenever there's a power plant, all the dirt around it becomes tainted, basically. And takes on a toxicity or some dangerous qualities. And so you got to figure out what do you do with this tainted soil now? Well, that's called manufactured gas plant waste, and that was being stored there. So we passed a law, that was what we amended the law to say, fine, that topic, that substance can't be stored above any sole source of water, which was a pretty narrow way to write the bill. And that was something that we were able to cobble enough Republican votes, Democratic votes to get it passed, and the governor ultimately signed that bill. So what we looked at it as is a way to deal with the most serious consequences of what was facing the water supply for me and for you. And this leaves a lot of people unhappy, right? Because that doesn't mean it's every possible thing that's over, that might be over the aquifer. And what about tomorrow's problem? Things we haven't even thought about yet. All these tainted substances that have to be stored somewhere, and now landfill companies get a lot of money if they are a place that has the liners and all these capabilities to store that. And so it became an issue of, well, this doesn't really do everything that we do. All it does is make sure that this one substance isn't there. And this is a fundamental disagreement that people have in legislation. Whether one bill can do everything you want it to do. There's a phrase that I love. It's from a book called The Gay Place, and it's a book it was written by one of LBJ's, Lyndon Johnson's press secretaries. And it was written about a governor in Texas, a fictional guy that was supposed to be Lyndon Johnson. And there's a conversation where he is talking to a person who agrees with him in principle, it's a legislator. And he says, well, look, I see what you're doing, but it doesn't go nearly far enough. You're selling out too early. You could get a lot more for it. And the governor says, do you think I could actually get that bill passed? We have the votes. Well, I don't know, but we can make a fight for it. We got to keep going. And what the governor's character said was, see, this is the problem with legislation. Legislation is getting something more than you have today. You have nothing today, you've got to work toward something else and take incremental steps. And the guy goes, yeah, I've heard before, half a loaf of bread is better than none. And the governor interrupts him and says, slice of damn bread. Okay? You don't have any food, a slice of bread is better than you have today. And that is the difference, and by the way, LBJ was probably the most successful legislative legislative leader we've ever had, because of that idea. The idea that nothing's ever done. You're going to be able to come back, but you have to build on some amendment. And if you continue to push for everything you want in any one bill, you're never going to get there. It's going to give your opponents all the ammo they need to say, this isn't reasonable, they're asking for way too much. And instead of getting something I can get for you today, we fight for the perfect, which often is the enemy of good, unfortunately. So finding that as a legislator is tough, and nobody can find that perfectly. But that is one thing that I think needs to be remembered, is when you're fighting for legislation, you might say, okay, look, what can we get done? What's the most we can actually get through today and build a coalition around? That's a good place to start. And then, once that's passed, it gives you something, by the way, to come back to the legislature with the next year and say, because an argument that's been very helpful to me is to say, when people go, well, I don't know about this bill, it sounds like it's pretty crazy, and I go, well, you just did this last year where we did X. I mean, it's almost the same thing. This just goes a little further. And that gives a bunch of scared legislators a little bit of confidence to go, okay, I've already voted for that, so I guess I can vote for this. It's understanding how that little incremental steps works on the psyche of a legislator. So that's something they won't teach you on these, but I have learned in my brief time. But the understanding that it's not, the danger of the monographer is not, is something that we have to continue to work with. And this is where you guys come in. So recognizing that I'm not a scientist, I'm a lawyer who just wants clean drinking water. To be fair, I've got self-interest in this. We'll give you selfish that way. And so the goal is, all right, instead of us being so reactive, instead of saying like, boy, it turns out they've been putting this terrible substance on our soil, over our water supply, what do we do next? What I wanted to do is try to figure out what we can do to anticipate it and fight for restrictions before they ever get near our water supply. And so this year, I passed a bill, and Representative Ammons carried it in the House. It was successful. It's sitting on the governor's desk now. It's called Senate Bill 611. And its goal is to say, we don't really know what the next danger to our water supply might be, but there's some people that do. So let's put a task force together. Let's put the best minds in the room, scientists, people from the landfill companies. We got to put people from farming. I literally put someone from the plumbing industry on there, because you got to think about pipes and all those things. And our goal was to put 20, 25 people who are experts to sit in a room, work on this, write a report for us, and let that lead the legislation. Instead of us being reactive and go, I know somebody called me and said, this topic this is going to be the most dangerous thing. I'd rather it come from a scientist. I'd rather it come from somebody that says, actually, this is what they're storing. In other states, I bet you this is going to be the next threat. And to deal with that before it gets into our water supply. So to me, that is something that, and I guess what I should say is, if you're interested and you have some expertise on that task force, when the governor, I've got to imagine he'll sign it. You just never know with the governor, but that seems like a bill that, again, we have bipartisan co-sponsors on the bill. And it seems, and the governor's actually the one who's very common for task forces to pick many of the people on the task force. We have set requirements, this is the expertise they'd have to have, but the governor ultimately selects them. If you're interested in that, SenatorBennett.com is this is not a political site, this is the state site, our official webpage. You can email us on that site and send us your resume, and we'll make sure it gets to the governor. And hopefully, we can get good local people with expertise on that task force, because I can't think of any more important than the clean drinking water of the area. Oh my gosh, way more time than I realized. Okay, on a similar topic, is something that I've been spending a lot of time in. If any of you get outside of Champaign-Urbana, just toward Indiana. To be fair, I didn't spend a lot of time there until it was in my district. There's it's really shocking, but the farmland that we all are very, very proud of is important around Champaign. But then you go just a little bit to the east, and all of a sudden topography changes entirely. It's very green and hilly and rolly, and it's beautiful. Golf courses are really nice as well. I'll get some commerce for that area of my district. But it also has some really pristine natural areas. We have some state parks. We have the state's only national scenic river, and it's called the Middle Fork of the Vermilion River, which is almost all the way on the Indiana border. And that is also in jeopardy in certain respects, because in the 1950s, because again, it was an area where there weren't a lot of people and it was a lot of wilderness area, the Illinois Power Company built a giant power plant. And that was a huge boon for the area. In fact, the middle school kids just outside of that area were called the Kilowatts. That was their mascot. And so it's interesting now as people go, nobody wanted this here. I'm like, well, you did name your mascot after it. And, like a lot of things, people really like industry. Who doesn't want cheap electricity and lower property taxes and good jobs for your area? People like that, but especially when you're talking about power and why it's important that those of you in this room that can help us with innovations about more clean energy and things like that. A lot of the last few generations of power have really serious byproducts, whether it's manufactured gas plant waste I talked about before, or coal ash, which is something that they have at this, now it's an abandoned plant. Dynegy is the company that owns it now. It has 3 giant coal ash pits, is what they are. And essentially, any power plant in this era would take coal and ship it in. They crush it down to a really fine surface. They put it in these giant boilers. That's what produces the energy. But when you burn something, there's some kind of an ash or a byproduct there, and that's coal ash. And it's got arsenic. It's got some very serious chemicals in it. And so power plants of that era would then take out giant pits and just leave it for the ages, I suppose. The problem is, particularly the first pits, were not lined in any way. So you have nothing underneath them. When it rains, the water seeps through that area, gets into your groundwater is the concern. And ultimately runs toward the Vermilion River, which is a very, very beautiful, literally I was there yesterday. We were there for an environmental tour, and a bald eagle's like flying overhead. It was really, really cool. But the concern of it is that if this area becomes, and the river, unfortunately, is eroding the bank and it's getting closer to the pits where these coal ash are. So you've got this, who can run out the clock type thing. Can you stop the change of the direction of the river, or can we move these coal ash pits before these two things collide? It's a very scary thing, and it's really freaking out a lot of the people, really everywhere in Central Illinois, but particularly in that area. And what I really like about that issue right now is that the coalition that we're putting together, it was Republican and Democratic legislators sitting across the room yelling at a power company yesterday. It's kind of weird. And you'd expect, especially when you're working a champion or band, you expect a certain political party, you pick which one you decide, that tends to fight for more environmental causes. And then you have groups that you know to be environmentalists fighting for those causes. And then, unfortunately, you often have farmers or you have business people on the other side saying, but there's reasons why we do those things. For whatever reason, right now, on those issues, we don't have that. We have the business community just as freaked out because they say, I don't know who's going to come here for tourism or how we're supposed to build any companies if we have a giant environmental catastrophe in our national scenic river. So that's something, there's no legislation on it right now, but it's something that the Republican representative for that area and the Democratic senator and myself are putting a lot of pressure on the Illinois EPA to try to encourage them to move the products in these pits. It is so much stuff, though, we just found this out yesterday, that even if they did something like 5 truckloads a day, it would take about 10 years to take all this stuff out. And if you're doing truckloads of coal ash, some of it's going to get swept away in the wind, and some of it's going to get your water, and some of it's going to, especially if you live near that area. So there's a lot of, as good as it would feel to say, we're getting that out of here, where do you take it, first of all? And then how do you get it out? And what problems do you have when you take it out of the ground, stuff that's been there for a really long time? Is it more of a risk? I don't know. Maybe some of you do. And this is why we're really trying to learn more and put the people in the room to ask those questions. Because I understand the power companies are always going to say this is safe, don't sweat it, but I also understand there's a financial reason sometimes to say that because it would cost hundreds of millions of dollars to take these pits out, so there's an incentive to say that. For that reason, I think it's important to put some smart people in the room and find out. Maybe coal ash is the next thing. By the way, they also store coal ash near the Muhammad Aquifer in other parts of the state. So these are also things that we're hoping to learn more about and find out just how dangerous is it. It's got some pretty nasty stuff in it, but is just the presence of that material enough to freak everybody out to the point we have to remove those. These are things that we're going to need some help in. So what I want to talk about, I guess, is ways, and I'm glad to answer questions, I'll stick around afterwards, but rather than go through all these different things, I think it would be helpful to kind of say how I think you guys can be productive in reaching out to us. There was a bill this year, Senate Bill 1821, and it's one of those bills that seems really good. It's going to clear up unnecessary red tape. That's how it's kind of sold to the legislature. There's all these things. You don't really need an advanced degree. You don't really, there's no reason we're keeping people out of business. We should probably, remove some of these restrictions. And so the sponsor really pushed for this bill. And then I started getting emails from some of my friends that work at UVI, many of whom are geologists. And they said, if this bill passes, basically there won't be any more registration for professional geologists. That can't be, right? That's not something I could figure out from a YouTube video. I'd like there to be some kind of license and registered geologists to know what they're doing when we talk about the water surveys, the PRI, and things like that. And by God, that's true. I sat with the sponsor and we started going through the 3 pages of professions that wouldn't be involved in it, and geologists are in there. And when I started asking the sponsor, who again has no science background, doesn't particularly care, doesn't hate rocks, she probably has no real reason to be against geologists, says maybe she took a hard 100-level class back in undergrad, I don't know. But she said, I really don't have a problem with taking that out, I guess. When the lobbyist or whoever wrote this up for us, they just included all these things, and I just kind of copied it and went from there. And so we removed geologists. Just that quickly, you can decide whether or not geologists have to get a PhD, become registered, do all those things, or you can just kind of say, I love rocks. I'm going to be a geologist today. For a while, I thought when I was just starting to say that, I was going to say, I love maps, and see if any of you realize that's geography. But again, if there's one room, I don't need to pretend to be stupid. You guys are all way smarter than me. You know that. So that's how quickly it can be done. And so in some respects, I recognize you guys spend a lot of time in labs. It isn't there are thousands and even tens of thousands of bills that get introduced every single year. How are you supposed to be reading all that? Isn't that my job to do? And in fact, we do a lot of those. But again, there's tens of thousands of bills, and if it's not coming through my committee, as this one did not, it may be that I don't see it until it comes on the board for us to vote on. And then literally the description I have is, this just gets rid of some red tape. You don't need to worry about it. It pretty much just cleans up some of the over-regulation. You know how that is, the bureaucracy. And that sounds pretty good. You press the green button, and next thing you know, you've got a problem. And so there are things like that. And, in that case, I happen to just know these geologists that seem to be unhappy with that. But the UVI in particular has a really, really good government relations team. Okay, lobbyists. You lobbyists. They're not like the sleazy lobbyists, like the power company guys called it before. They're not like that. They're legit. But they really care a lot about the university. They have good relationships with legislators, and they're really good about, hey, sound the alarm. This is a really big deal. You need to help us in this area. How do you get to them? Well, the chancellor's office is probably a suggestion. Your deans or your professors may be able to help you with that. But the other thing is, most people in the school, you're in pretty major colleges in the UVI. I probably know your deans, and they can reach me pretty easily. So keep that in mind. If you have issues or you're hearing things or your association or there's some blog or whatever that says, hey, do you know this bill does this? Your job may not be to worry about it, but you might want to mention it to somebody a little higher up that does this for a living to say, hey, can you check on this? Because the very sponsor of the bill may not even know it was in there, which should give you no peace of mind, but it's still the case. So what I'd like to do, I guess, and I'll be glad to talk about some more legislation, but I don't want to be that boring. So can we maybe ask you, are there any questions? I'll keep talking, but if there are questions, I'll be glad to go through some of those as well. About the process or about things that you'd like to see affected or anything like that. You got a question?
Sure.
Oh, thank goodness. Okay.
So you just said that you only go in depth with the bills that are in your committee. So which senators are selected for which committees? Do you select them or who?
So that's a great question. The question was, if really your expertise is in the areas of your committees, well, who decides who's on what committee? And sometimes it is based on our own interests. We certainly put it at the beginning of every session what committees are important to us. So for example, I serve on higher education, I serve on the budget committee, I serve on agriculture, I serve on criminal law, I serve on labor, and gaming. Interesting, huh? Daniel's interested in casino. But so those are the areas that I've asked for and have I don't have seniority yet, but I've been a little bit longer, so I was able to get the committees I wanted. There are certain times when maybe a committee conflicts with another one. So I've had this situation where I wanted to be on judiciary, for example, which is another law-related one. It conflicts with higher education, same exact time. That's a no-brainer for me. I'm going to go for higher education. But that's sometimes it's just simply that one, when you can meet. It's like taking a class. So if you have two classes, you want to take at the same time. But there are times when they try to, they'll encourage you to say, hey, I see you're a prosecutor, maybe you want to be on criminal law, because they don't know what they're doing. Which may or may not be a quote that I was receiving. But, there's certain areas where they might, especially new legislators, they kind of guide you that way. But you don't have to be there very long before you realize that, boy, you start seeing bills that are important to you, and you go, how did I not know about this bill before? And you're like, I should probably be on that committee. We are very lucky. We have, well, you can't see it, but like a tablet up here. We have laptops on our desks, and literally, it's not like Washington, D.C., where in Washington, you're literally in your office, you're across the street making fundraising calls, you're doing all kinds of other things. And then there's a series of bells, and I'm sure you get cell phone text now. But when I was an intern for Senator Durbin when I was in law school, and back then, it's literally clocks, and they would have, a bell system, and lights would light up, and it meant like, oh, time to vote. And then you would go across the street, and you sometimes take a train, a little trolley from the office buildings to the Capitol underground. And then you get there, and you walk in the chamber, and you put your card in the back of the room. You don't even have to sit down, that's all for show. And then you press the yes or no button, and then you take off and go and do what you're doing again. That's not how it is in Springfield. In Springfield, you were voting all day long, particularly in May. Not so much in the first few months of the session. In Springfield, I guess I should have started with that. The session is, in a normal year, the beginning of January until the end of May. And then you have a few weeks of veto session where, then we send all the bills we pass to the governor, and he has most of the summer to decide whether or not he is going to veto that bill or sign it into law. And if he vetoes it, then we come back sometime in the fall and we can try to override his veto. Okay, so that's normally the schedule. What that means is the first few months, like the first month in January is just writing the bills and talking to people. February and March is mostly committee work, and you're just trying to like kind of iron out your bills and figure out how do I get enough votes on this thing by changing it. And then April and May is just voting. So when you hear people go, why'd you miss this vote, or why'd you do that? Well, largely it's probably because I was on the floor for 10 hours. And you step out to go to the restroom, or because a constituent comes to talk to you, or 100 other things. And so that does happen on occasion if you're not really paying attention. If there's a bill you really care about, UI funding is coming up, I'm going to sit down and wait a little while. Even if I have a constituent outside that wants to meet, you have to make sure you're in your chair if you're going to vote. And so that's the process that we have in Springfield. And so because of that, I'm not sure where this started. Because of that, you get to see all these bills come up, and you get to see how your committee votes, how the committee votes. And that often is a great way to do it too, is if you go, well, I don't really know much about this bill, I don't really have a feeling one way or another about it, but there's a senator next to me that has a district that's very similar. Maybe there's another downstate district that's fairly evenly divided partisan-wise, and I know they've got good judgment, they were on the committee and they voted yes. I might feel a little more comfortable, If I don't have that, like, okay, I better get some information and, read as quickly as possible. In the old days, they literally used to bring these giant binders. I mean, you can imagine the end of May, every bill you had to have a paper copy, and if they changed really quickly, they'd have somebody come out and pass out all these new copies. Not environmentally friendly, of course. And now, it's amazing. You can come in up, I can do research, I can read the whole bill, I can email people, I can do all those things right there as they're debating the bill. So it's a much more informed process, I think, than they used to have, where people go, I don't know, I'm not going to flip through the binder to find that. There's really no excuse not to at least know kind of something about how you're voting. But because of that, sometimes that may draw you to a committee you didn't think about getting on before, because you realize a lot of things are important to you. It's a great question. Other questions?
So my question regards that red tape bill that you were talking about earlier. I happen to be a geology PhD student, so that's particularly relevant to me. I was curious about how the geologists that got in touch with you, how they're aware of that portion of the bill that would affect geology registration, because I feel like just as an everyday geology student, professor, for example, I feel like that's something you could easily miss, especially if you're not following along with types of legislation like this.
Are you not familiar with the geologist cabal that is going on?
Apparently not.
Okay. They have t-shirts. No, and to be fair, I realize that is a high bar to set, right? You know, like, if you know about someone, just send me a text. Like, that seems unlikely. In retrospect, now that it's said out loud. But I think in this case, there really was a group of geologists that were talking about it and saying, hey, did you hear about this bill? And, you know, because of social media and other things, I think people are a little more aware, at least of rumors. I mean, and there's no guarantee that the geologists actually looked it up or anything. They just heard about it and knew me, and at some point I gave them a cell phone and they, you know, sent me a text on it. Typically, it is the university's job to stay on top of that, and they do a really good job of it. And in fact, I won't say that the government affairs person didn't come talk to me, because again, we never voted on they would have talked to me before the bill probably came, but we got it removed before that even happened because somebody contacted me early, okay? And needless to say, in a year like this, the government affairs people who will do a great job for UVI are more budget driven than individual bill driven, right? Their efforts are making sure UVI is not removed entirely from the budget lines. One example, I guess, and I kind of jogged my memory on this is, we spent a little time today in one of the MRI labs and talking about small animals. And a really contentious bill that came out last year had to do with animals that are tested in labs. And often they're dogs that are beagles. What is it? Oh, no? There's no? No? Anyway, I love beagles. So, do whatever you want. Scientists. But, here's a contempt. And so the original bill, and this is how, again, when I say that science is not, it's not all scientists making these decisions, because what happened was an animal rights group said, you know what I'd love to see is that all these beagles that are researched on, that they're tested in labs, they should have a chance at a full life when the research is done. Okay, they should be able to go to a shelter, and they should be adopted, all those things. And suddenly, I have a lot of calls that say, you love beagles, don't you, Senator Bennett? Like, you want to make sure these beagles get homes, right? And people literally showing up at committee hearings with, like, dogs, like, how can you get that in? And what happens then is you literally are drawn then between, because, you know, a lot of the labs and others are coming forward and saying, I don't know if you know what we do when we do the testing on some of the dogs, but they often aren't able to be then re-socialized or socialized into a normal setting for, you know, myriad reasons. But this may not be a good fit, and it might also be difficult, you know, and several labs are saying we do that, of course, in all the chances we can. We prefer not to hurt these animals, but to put a one-size-fits-all solution to this may be difficult. And so, of course, this affected the vet school at UVI. They do a lot of research in many probably schools here. And so they had a position as well as other labs. Ultimately, the bill didn't pass the first time around. But animal bills are hard to vote against, all right? In 2010, one of the reasons that a colleague of mine, Bill Brady, was not elected as our governor in the state, he won 101 counties of the 102, but he didn't win cooking. That's an important one. But he had a bill for a veterinarian buddy of his, like 5 years before, where the veterinarian said, you know what's unfortunate is when I have to euthanize dogs, and I have to spend all this money to get the chamber set up a certain way, and I got to do one, and then by law I can only do one at a time, and you know, it doesn't really make a difference. Like, I could do more than one dog, and then Bill Brady said, yeah, that's fine. I'll just do it so you can do multiple animals at once. It went nowhere in the legislature, but he put his name on the bill. And that was enough when you run for governor, and you better bet every bill you ever put or ever looked at is coming back to bite you. And suddenly that became on the flyers that he's trying to put dogs in mass gas chambers, right? That doesn't sound like somebody I want to put in charge of my schools. And so, you know, that looks pretty bad on the flyer. So it's things like that where, you know, you get legislators that go, look, I mean, my lab people say they're doing the best they can, and this is too much, but I really want to see that my name in the same similar flyer down the road. And so what we were able to do was, you know, the bill died one year, and then we came back the next year and found a more practical way to make sure that, you know, the animal rights issues were being dealt with, and we want to make sure as many dogs as possible were getting good homes. But maybe a one-size-fits-all, I'm going to guess the veterinary school at UVI has a very different lab testing method than maybe a private lab does that does, you know, really nasty chemicals in other parts of the state. So having one law that affects them the same way probably isn't great law, great policy. So that's an example of, I got really involved in that. I had a lot of the vet school calling me and saying like, look, we're not monsters. So I'm a veterinarian. I bet you I love dogs more than you do, which is fair. But at the same time, recognizing that sometimes what feels good and what a lot of people are calling me on, I had a lot of constituents calling me on that bill, they may not have the full picture and full grasp of it. So that was another situation where they didn't have my cell phone, but they were reaching out to me through our office. The big thing is not sitting quietly. I mean, my job is to be your voice in Springfield, and I can't do that if you don't reach out to me. So whether it's you see something on social media, or you're sitting around the lab and you're talking about a certain thing, it's important you reach out, because you can pretty much guess that the special interest group for the other side is sending people my way. Phone calls people get and go, do you hate taxes? Well, sure, I hate taxes. Press 1 for your senator, tell me you hate taxes. And so then we get a couple hundred calls of people that all hate taxes, and I'm like, I understand, I also hate taxes. But then you go through some of these taxes by, and they're like, oh no, those are legit. Taxes are okay for those things. It all depends on how you ask the question. It all depends on how you advocate for those things. But if you have specified knowledge of things, you want to make sure your voice is heard, I guess is my point. Other questions? Are we close on time? Oh yes, I'm sorry. I thought you were here for a second. I'm not a tall man.
Sorry. So I was a little interested in, it seemed like you were kind of implying that
No.
if a scientist is interested and able, they're more than welcome to advise one of these committees. But I mean, at least at the federal level right now, we're seeing a lot of this sort of pushback on like the elitism of researchers in higher ed. And I'm wondering if you're seeing any of that in the state, and whether there is just sort of resistance to having experts in the room.
Yeah, I would be concerned at this point, scientists, if you contact federal legislators, you may be getting on a registry. I'd worry about your safety. They're getting lists together. That's also a joke. I'm gonna stop. Can't joke when things are that close to real. Try to keep all the room. No, the question is, how active should you be in the process? And I know this is a weird time where, at least, and I think this is largely news-driven, where you actually have, people doubting science, people doubt even legitimate news sources, people doubt all these things. And so it becomes a point where you're like, I don't know where the firm soil is at this point on these issues. I don't see that in Springfield. You don't see people embracing, I think, ignorance on a statewide level. Certainly we could do more to help guide the federal discussion. There's a resolution that many of us got on, and I think this is probably bipartisan, where we encourage the federal government to re-engage in the Paris agreements. There's things you can do as a state to kind of guide that, but ultimately, especially when you're talking about world states, the federal government is the one people listen to, not a state, particularly a state that went 2 years without a budget. It may not be the beacon that people are looking to, for whatever reason. But so on the state level, I don't get that sense. I guess the only way I do get the sense is when you see people not making a commitment to higher education, to many of the ways that would indirectly fund science. But I think ultimately the fights we have are economic ones and not based on dogma or things like that. So I haven't gotten that impression. By and large, the people I serve with on both sides of the aisle, I think, recognize the value of science and those things. It's just recognizing that every decision is a lost game, right? If I fund UI, that means I'm not funding something back in my district and explaining to you why this is a good investment when I go home. And this is something that I spend a lot of my time doing is explaining why it's not a, UI, for example, or just higher education is not a regional interest, but a statewide or even a national interest. And UI helps with that when they do innovation, when they do those things, because I can say how their life is better. When we get a medical school that is able to do, to work with our engineering as well as the other sciences, there will be innovations that will improve everybody's life. So it's not just about, sometimes you'll hear, it's not just about the 60-year senior, who's trying to find themselves with their fifth major. I mean, that's the image that people are like, I'm sick of funding this when I could be funding my rape crisis center back in my district, and that's legit. But it's a matter of recognizing that maybe their stereotype is just that and not based on reality. Yeah, you have a question?
Okay, I kind of think this is the big question that's, obviously we haven't had a budget for 2 years, and part of your talk, thankfully so, was to describe how things get done. So I guess there's a separate answer for every representative and every senator in Springfield, but in your mind, what broke down in the process, A, and B, how can we as constituents help so that it doesn't break down again in the future?
Boy. So I was really pandering. I just said, get rid of Madigan, and then everybody would clap. That's usually how my district works, but and anybody thinks that one person or one thing leads to the breakdown of a system, the understanding is incomplete. I'll say it that way. It's really easy to point to a governor, to point to the speaker. The fact is, the breakdown that we have on the national level as well as on our state level does come from the fact that sides are just far, far too polarized. There really is a reasonable center on most of these bills, right? And recognizing that in the budget, that's the approach that I came forward and said, look, we are woefully, we're spending $11 million a day more than we have coming in. Because without a budget, the courts basically said, everything that's got a contract with the state is going to keep going out on autopilot. Well, that's great unless you're in social services or higher education, because those groups didn't have contracts, which means every other group, money kept going out at an old rate, which is about $40 billion a year, and we're only bringing in about $32 billion a year. So that's how we accumulate so much extra debt. It seems to me that a reasonable approach is to try to find some cuts, to raise some revenue, some taxes to make up some of the rest, and certainly to acknowledge that the state could use certain reforms that we can go and look at. And each of these reforms have about 1 million different combinations that you can bring in. You can bring in the far right reform, you can bring in a far left reform, or again, find a balanced approach where you can try to do those things. So when I say that, I mean like workers' compensation, which is something probably none of you care about, but a lot of people do, and recognizing that if you own a business and you pay workers' compensation insurance, there's things you could do to keep those costs down, which means more jobs ultimately in the state. But there's a lot of ways to do that, and this is where I get back to the slice of bread even. What we have ultimately is a situation where often the speaker has said, I'm not giving you anything, and then the governor goes, I want all 10 of these things. And what we've tried to do in the Senate is go, how about 6? Would you give us 6? Could we get to a 6 and then recognize that some of these are going to be non-starters for the other side, and we'll get to that point. And thus far, 6 has not been a number that's been agreeable. The perfect example is we have a school funding formula in the state, which is acknowledged to be by both sides the worst, least equitable funding in the country. Meaning that everybody pays property taxes and they go into the dryer in Springfield and it comes back out, and it's very unfair the way it comes out. So in certain areas in the suburbs of Chicago, or maybe some of you are from, you might have gotten 4 times the funding per pupil that you get in rural Illinois downstate or in the city of Chicago. And obviously that's wrong. So we've been working for years to try to find a new formula. And the formula that was passed, the education secretary for the governor 3 weeks ago said, the governor likes about 90% of it, but he's going to veto it. And that was one where you just go, I don't know what to do at this point, because in Springfield, in life, if you get 90% of what you want, you take it and you run, and you recognize that is a huge win. Particularly when the status quo is something that is so inequitable and wrong. So rather than lock people into a bad system, you get the 90% and then you fight for more as you see the problems develop. That's the way I approach it, and that's not the way that people on either side of the spectrum are approaching it right now. So it is, because of that, it's the first time we've had divided government, by the way. I walked in here today and I thought of a story of Stan Weaver. I know I'm getting close on time, so please just stop when you get to go. You guys have things to do. Stan Weaver had the job I hold now. And I won't say he had my job because it was his job. He was a state senator for the 52nd District from like 1968 until about 2002. And U of I is U of I because of Stan Weaver, who, by the way, was Republican. But from the 70s and 80s and 90s, brought over $1 billion to the University of Illinois. He did that because he had the leadership and the respect in Springfield. He became the majority leader in the Senate. So the Senate was then controlled by the Republicans. And Arnold Beckman, I saw, where did Hector go? Hector, is he in here? He had a shirt on with Arnold Beckman's quote on the back, which is pretty weird, but awesome still. He's an industrialist, the guy this building is named after. Late 80s, about 30 years ago, Arnold Beckman comes into town, he meets with then President Stanley Eckenberry, and he says, I got $50 million to build a state-of-the-art science center. But like most rich dudes, they don't really understand things like delays, and they said, but I need it done in 18 months, which is a pretty tough thing to do in a state when nothing things are done. And St. Eckenberry goes, did you say $50 million in the late 1980s? And he goes, yeah, we'll do that, no problem. They didn't even have the land. This wasn't UI owned, this is where we're standing right now. So they then, St. Eckenberry, President Eckenberry went to the senator, the state senator at the time, Stan Weaver, and said, so I need you to make this happen. You need to get us the land, you need to help make sure, get to the procurement, we gotta make sure this all gets done. And they got it done. There was a process called quick take, which is, if you're familiar with eminent domains, when the government says, you know how this area was probably gas stations and things like that, that's all going to be gone, and we're going to take that, and that's really unpopular, right? It's unpopular locally, it's unpopular in Springfield, and quick take, because it makes it really fast, is really, really rare. It's basically an act of the legislature, which you have to get done immediately, because then you still have to build the building. You got it done. They got it done. This building is here because they were able to get something through that quickly. I don't think that would happen now, guys. I mean, I couldn't get you a budget in 18 months, much less do quick take. And I just think, in one respect, is because our priorities are a little bit different. All right, if higher education is seen as a partisan fight, that's a problem. But ultimately, many of the same things the governor's fighting for, with innovation, with new technology, with all those things, you guys deal with that here in the building, right? The new jobs that can come from these innovations. So I think there is an argument to be made by that to say, this isn't just about math grants. It's also about the next generation of taxpayers, which we hope you are, and also the next generation of new inventions and innovations and companies, which we hope are here in Illinois. And so I think it's getting back to remembering that and remembering the things we could do from a higher education and science standpoint. And not think this is just money for students to go and spend a lot of time out in Champaign. It's also about the things you guys create and the people you become while you're here. And Brad, you guys saw that. We talked a little bit about his research will start in one area, and because he works with engineering and medical and all these other things, it might take a very different path, right? And so that's the other idea, putting this many freakish minds in one spot. It also allows you guys to snowball and work and find new outlets for maybe what you started with. And so I think that's a really important thing to do. In the state, we've spent a lot of effort dealing with that. I think it's about maybe rebranding our argument and explaining from a higher education standpoint why this is also a good economic argument. It's not just a hard argument, it's a head argument as well. That's just higher ed. In terms of fixing everything, I don't have the answers for that, unfortunately. But I imagine it has to do more with people that reach toward the center, as opposed to people on the far ends. Because this is the truth. There are people in the legislature that will never vote for a tax increase for anything. This means we're going to lay off every police officer in your town. So what? Good. State of nature. That's great. And there are those on the other side. I'm not kidding you. I serve with these people. And on the other side, you have people that absolutely not. We don't need to cut a single dollar from the budget. Everything's great. The budget, by the way, is this big. I don't need to go through it. I know every dollar, is important, and we should just have, what's Sweden have? 50% tax rate? We can do that. Who wouldn't want the paid leave? That sounds great. This is what you're dealing with on both sides, and there's just so much in between that I think is being left on the plate because you don't have enough people reaching toward that. So, particularly at the executive level and leadership level, I think that's what we have to look for. And then, fortunately, that's not really what gets exciting, right? When we're talking about the presidential, how quickly, do you cast aside both the Democrats and the Republicans that seem like, it's milquetoast, right? That's boring, low energy, all the different adjectives you heard for Jeb Bush or whoever else. Those people had no chance because they didn't excite the base to get people excited. But ultimately, the fire you see in some of those early campaign speeches, you're now seeing people try to campaign that way, or try to govern that way, and that's terrifying. Anybody else? I lost my, you right here. So I just thank you very much for.
All right, so thank you, Senator for coming, giving an excellent talk.
I really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone, for coming to our event, for coming, giving some awesome, great questions. And last but not least, I would like to thank everyone who helped make this event possible once again. And as Science Policy Group, we would like to give a memento of this occasion. So to say, it is a giant beaker mug with our Science Policy Group logo on it.
So thank you very much.
And so, if you would like to stay current with all of our future events, please sign in the lobby of the sign-in sheet, and we have future events then, and we'll let you know. Thank you all for attending once again. Thank you.
Thank you.